Right now, somewhere in the Persian Gulf, a tanker captain received a message on the International Emergency Distress Frequency. The message was simple: the Strait of Hormuz is closed. Any vessel attempting to pass will be set ablaze. That message, broadcast by Iran's Revolutionary Guard, was heard by every ship in the region, and almost every single one of them stopped, dropped anchor, and waited. That moment, that one message, triggered what energy analysts are now calling the most dangerous oil supply disruption in the history of the modern world. Not the 1973 Arab oil embargo, not the 1979 Iranian Revolution, not Russia cutting off Europe in 2022. This, right now, March 2026. And if it doesn't get resolved in the next few days, you are looking at the very real possibility of oil hitting $200 a barrel, a price that would crash economies, kill jobs, empty grocery shelves, and send inflation roaring back to levels not seen since the 1970s. And here's the part that should genuinely concern every single person watching this video. Whether you live in New York, London, Delhi, or Seoul, none of this is happening in a vacuum. Iran is not just threatening to close a waterway. Iran is executing a deliberate, calculated economic strategy. A strategy designed to make the pain of this war so unbearable for the rest of the world that global pressure forces the United States and Israel to back down. The question I want to answer today is it working? And what happens to you and me and the rest of the world if it does? Welcome to Unlocked History Hub. I have spent the last several days tracking every piece of economic data, every analyst report, and every geopolitical development coming out of this conflict. And what I'm about to share with you is not just a news summary. This is a complete breakdown of Iran's economic warfare strategy, the real-world damage already being done to the global economy, and my honest personal take on where this is heading. If you're someone who wants to actually understand what's going on, not just read a headline, this is the video for you. And before we go any further, if you haven't already, please hit like and subscribe to Unlocked History Hub right now. We cover the stories that shape the world, and we do it without spin. Your support makes that possible. Now let's start with the geography, because you cannot understand this story without understanding one stretch of water about 33 kilometers wide. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran and Oman, connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. It is the world's most important energy chokepoint. Not important in the way that sounds like a textbook fact. Important in the way that, without it functioning normally, the global economy begins to suffocate. Through that narrow corridor, approximately 20 million barrels of oil pass every single day. That number represents roughly 20% of everything the entire world consumes. Not just a little. 1 in every 5 barrels of oil that keeps planes flying, trucks moving, factories running, and power grids alive goes through that strait. And on top of the oil, 22% of the world's entire supply of liquefied natural gas flows through the same corridor, mostly from Qatar, the largest LNG exporter on the planet. Before February 28, 2026, most energy traders had a working assumption baked into their models for years. Nobody will ever actually close the Strait of Hormuz. Iran had threatened it dozens of times over 2 decades. It was a bluff, a card they waved but never played because the strait is also Iran's own economic lifeline. It's how Iran exports its own oil. Closing it, analysts always said, would be tightening the noose around Iran's own neck. But here's what changed on February 28th. When the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, striking Iran's nuclear facilities, missile sites, leadership targets, and killing Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran was no longer calculating based on economic self-interest. Iran was calculating based on survival, and a country fighting for its survival plays by completely different rules. Within 48 hours of the first strikes, Iran's IRGC formally announced the strait was closed. They began attacking tankers. At least 5 were damaged in the first week. About 150 ships were left stranded in the waters around the strait. Vessel tracking data from Kepler showed that commercial operators, major oil companies, and shipping insurers had all but pulled out of the corridor. Maersk and MSC, 2 of the world's largest shipping carriers, suspended Gulf transits entirely. Ships were being rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope instead, adding 15 to 20 extra days to every journey between Asia and Europe, and exploding freight costs overnight. Insurance premiums for Gulf passage shot to 6-year highs, making the economics of the route impossible even for ships that might have tried. The result was a de facto closure of the most important waterway on Earth. Not through military force. Iran doesn't need to physically block every ship. They just need to make the risk and the cost so unbearable that the global shipping community walks away on its own. And that is exactly what happened. Now let's talk about what this did to energy prices, because the numbers here are staggering. Before the attacks, Brent crude, the global benchmark, was sitting around $70 per barrel, a comfortable, manageable price. Within days of the Hormuz closure, Brent surged past $100 for the first time since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. It hit $119 per barrel before partially pulling back. American gasoline prices rose 17% in a single week. Diesel prices are on track to reach between $4.50 and $5 per gallon if the strait stays shut. LNG spot prices in Asia more than doubled in just days, reaching their highest levels in 3 years after Qatar's Ras Laffan plant, the single largest LNG liquefaction facility on the planet, responsible for 20% of all global LNG production, declared force majeure following Iranian drone strikes on the facility. And here's the number that should be burned into your memory: $200 per barrel. That is not a wild prediction by some eccentric analyst on the internet. That is the figure cited by Claudio Galimberti, chief economist at Rystad Energy, one of the most respected energy consulting firms in the world. He told The Hill directly, if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed and Saudi Arabia, which pumps 10 million barrels a day and has no way to get much of it to market without Hormuz, is eventually forced to shut in production, oil goes to $200. And at $200 per barrel, you do not have a price spike. You have a global recession. Galimberti's exact words were that the world would be brought pretty much into a recession, and he is not alone. Mark Finley, a former senior U.S. economist at BP and fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute, called this the absolute biggest disruption the world's oil market has ever seen. Ever. Including every crisis since World War II. Now, I want to walk you through, country by country, region by region, exactly what this is doing to real people. Because this isn't abstract economics. This is your grocery bill, your heating cost, your job security, and in some places around the world, your ability to put food on the table at all. Let's start with Asia, because Asia is bearing the heaviest direct hit. China, India, Japan, and South Korea together account for roughly 70% of all the oil that flows through the Strait of Hormuz and 80% of the LNG. China gets half its crude imports through Hormuz. India imports approximately 85% of its crude oil, and nearly half of that comes from the Gulf. Every single dollar that oil rises per barrel adds an estimated $2 billion to India's annual import bill. With Brent already surging, the Indian rupee has come under serious pressure. The Reserve Bank of India is stuck in a bind. Raise interest rates to protect the currency, and you slow down an economy that was growing at over 6%. Hold rates steady, and you risk imported inflation crushing ordinary Indian households who are already feeling the squeeze. And the pain isn't just at the gas pump in India. More than 400,000 metric tons of basmati rice grown for export are stuck at Indian ports right now because the war has disrupted shipping lanes across the Middle East. Roughly 75% of India's basmati rice exports go to Middle Eastern countries, and those supply chains are broken right now. Japan and South Korea are in similarly serious trouble. Both countries are among the world's most energy import-dependent nations. Japan generates a significant portion of its electricity from LNG. South Korea's industrial economy, semiconductors, shipbuilding, steel, runs on imported energy. When LNG prices double in a week, that is not a minor inconvenience for these countries. That is a direct hit to manufacturing costs, electricity bills, and household budgets. South Korea's stock market already triggered a circuit breaker, an automatic halt in trading, in what analysts called its worst single-day decline since the 2008 financial crisis. In Europe, the situation is complicated by the fact that the continent was only just beginning to recover from the 2022 energy shock caused by Russia cutting off natural gas. European countries, Particularly Germany, France, and the UK had worked for 3 years to rebuild their energy security. And now, just as that recovery was taking hold, the LNG supply from Qatar, which had become a critical European energy source after the Russian disruption, is offline. Bloomberg Economics warned directly that for Europe, sustained higher energy prices would take the economy to the brink of recession. Germany's ADAC, the continent's largest automobile association, reported that gasoline and diesel prices in Germany jumped by double digits in a single week. Goldman Sachs projected that if oil stays at current levels for several months, U.S. consumer price inflation could rise from 2.4% in January to 3% by the end of the year. That might not sound dramatic, but remember, the Fed was supposed to be cutting interest rates this year to ease pressure on borrowers. That is now off the table. Instead, the Federal Reserve is paralyzed, facing an economy that needs lower rates, but inflation that is screaming for them to be held high. And then there's the piece of this story that almost nobody is talking about enough: food. Energy and food are the twin pillars of economic stability for billions of people around the world, and both are now under simultaneous threat from this conflict. Here is the connection most people don't see. Roughly 30% of the world's fertilizer exports, urea, ammonia, phosphates, sulfur, pass through the Strait of Hormuz. These are the chemicals that farmers around the world put into their soil to grow the food that feeds humanity. If fertilizer supply is disrupted for months, the agricultural production cycle is damaged. Crops planted with too little fertilizer yield less food, and less food means higher food prices globally, not just in the Middle East. The world's poorest countries, in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and parts of Latin America, will feel this first and feel it hardest. The Washington Post noted directly that the conflict is already threatening food shortages in poor countries. Motorists in Dhaka, Bangladesh, were photographed in lines at gas stations, fearing shortages. Pakistan, which was already battling inflation above 20% before any of this started, is now projected by Capital Economics to be forced into raising interest rates even further, the exact opposite of what its struggling economy needs. Now let me give you my personal read on Iran's strategy here, because I think the way this is being covered in the mainstream media is missing something important. Most of the coverage frames Iran's Hormuz closure as purely a military retaliation, a punchback. But I think that misses the sophistication of what Iran is actually doing. Iran knows it cannot defeat the United States and Israel militarily. Nobody in Tehran has that illusion. What Iran can do is make the cost of this war so unbearable for the rest of the world, and by extension for the domestic political situation inside the United States, that pressure mounts for a negotiated end before the regime collapses. Every dollar oil rises is another percentage point of inflation that lands on American household budgets. And President Trump, who has staked enormous political capital on lowering the cost of living, lowering interest rates, and keeping his Republican majority in the November midterms, is acutely aware of this. It is not a coincidence that Trump went on CBS News, in the middle of the biggest oil price spike in decades, to say the strait was still open and that ships were passing through. That was economic jawboning, talking the price down. And it worked temporarily. Oil fell 8% in a single day on his comments. That tells you something important. The market is incredibly sensitive to any signal that the Hormuz disruption might end soon. Iran understands this. Their strategy is not to win a war. Their strategy is to create enough economic pain, fast enough, that the political cost of continuing the war outweighs the strategic benefit for Washington. Whether that strategy works depends entirely on how long the Hormuz disruption lasts and how effectively the U.S. military can escort tankers through the strait. Some analysts, including those at the International Crisis Group, believe the disruption will be short-lived, days, maybe 2 weeks, because the U.S. military has both the capability and the political motivation to reopen the corridor. Trump does not want $4.50 diesel going into the midterms. That calculation is real. But here is where I genuinely disagree with the optimistic scenario, and I want to be transparent that this is my own analytical view. The assumption that Iran will simply back down once U.S. military pressure mounts is the same assumption that was wrong about the original decision to close the strait. Iran is an institution, specifically the IRGC, that is fighting for its institutional survival. The same IRGC that was still launching drone strikes on Gulf states and U.S. military bases in the second week of the conflict. The same IRGC that struck Qatar's Ras Laffan facility knowing full well the global consequences. These are not the actions of an organization calculating economic self-interest. These are the actions of an organization that has decided the rules of the old game no longer apply because the stakes have changed. And here is the historical parallel that haunts me when I think about this. In 1973, when Arab oil producers launched their oil embargo against the United States over the Yom Kippur War, American economists and policymakers genuinely believed it would be over in weeks. They thought they could absorb the shock. They were wrong. The 1973 oil shock triggered a global recession, years of stagflation, and fundamentally restructured the global economy and American domestic politics for a decade. The Federal Reserve of that era, as MIT economist Simon Johnson pointed out, made the crucial mistake of treating the oil shock as temporary and accommodating it with loose monetary policy. The result was inflation that embedded itself into the economy for years. The current Fed is haunted by that memory. They know they cannot repeat that mistake. The world is at a fork in the road right now. One path leads to a negotiated ceasefire in the coming days or weeks, probably brokered through Oman or another neutral intermediary, and a gradual reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, with oil prices slowly returning to somewhere near normal, and the global economy absorbing the shock with some pain but without a recession. The other path, if the Hormuz closure stretches beyond a month, if Saudi production is disrupted, if Iran escalates further, leads to $200 oil, a global recession, food inflation devastating the developing world, and a financial crisis that could rival 2008 in its scope. The difference between those two paths is being decided right now in the next few days, through military decisions, diplomatic back channels, and political calculations being made in Washington, Tel Aviv, Tehran, Riyadh, and Beijing. And I'll close with this thought because I think it's the most important thing I can say. The real lesson of every major energy crisis in history is that the damage is never evenly distributed. The people who suffer most from $200 oil are not the shareholders of ExxonMobil or the hedge funds that bet long on crude. They are the single mother in Chicago paying $5 a gallon to get to her second job. They are the farmer in Bangladesh who can't afford fertilizer and whose harvest fails. They are the family in Pakistan whose electricity just became unaffordable. The geopolitical chess being played in the Persian Gulf has human consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield, and every person watching this video, wherever you are in the world, has a stake in how this ends. That is what I want you to think about. That is the conversation I want you to have with the people around you. If this analysis gave you a clearer, deeper understanding of what is actually happening and why it matters to your life, then do something with it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to know, do you think the strait gets reopened soon? Or are we heading for the worst-case scenario? Share this video with someone who needs to understand what is going on. Send it to a friend, post it, put it in a group chat, because these are the conversations that matter. Thank you for watching Unlocked History Hub. Stay sharp, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.